Thank you for coming. Thank you, salute, and everything. My name is Ian Sargent. Let me just give you some context. It's within the context of the Coventry Biennial, themes of the hyper-possible, of radical legacies, of artist-led networks, activisms and pedagogies, and through hyperpaths of new know-how and personal and public dissent and do-it-yourself, which interferences takes place in contextualizing the practices and legacies of the Black Art Group, including the Black Art movements of the 1980s. I decided to call this event Interferences because I saw the work of the Black Art Group of the late 1970s and the early 1980s as being that friction, disruption, and interference to what was happening in art in Britain at the time, or being taught in art schools. Not only that, their art was charged with a socio-political awareness, which as the conversations today will reveal, probably hadn't been experienced in Britain before, or outside London at least. That is why this region, the Midlands, deserves to be recognised as a significant hub for arts and culture, and is perhaps why Coventry is now host to the City of Culture, the Turnip Prize, and the Coventry Biennial. And in 2022, Birmingham will host the Commonwealth Games and Cultural Festival, and Wolverhampton will host the British Art Show. Some of you that know me are aware of my research and my curatorial practice into the history of the Black Art Group, but it isn't a dormant history waiting to be discovered in an archive because artists Marlene, Keith, Claudette, and Eddie Chambers continue to practice and write nationally and internationally. Their art and that of the late Donald Rodney are also being exhibited, loaned and acquired by galleries and institutions. Academically and culturally, they all continue to contribute to new knowledge in institutions, and the formation of the Black Art Research Project in 2011 by Keith, Marlene and Claudette has been pivotal in the dissemination of historical and contemporary Black arts practice and pedagogies in Britain. Interferences is a platform for us to hear some more about the personal histories and the aesthetic practices, especially in relation to the Pan-Afrikan Connection exhibition, which took place here at the Herbert nearly 40 years ago. Asking why the exhibition perhaps asking why the exhibition remains pertinent today as it did in 1983. The work produced by the group of people who were still only students at the time spoke of a black aesthetic, as quoted by Claudette Johnson in an artist statement for the exhibition, adding that the work of the black artist involved the expression of her or his life experience. So today's first discussion will be led by researcher and curator, Professor Carolina Rito, whose work is situated at the intersection between the knowledge production, the curatorial, and contested historical narratives. Carolina is a professor of creative practice research at the Research Centre for Arts, Memory and Communities at Coventry University. She's an executive board member of the Midlands Higher Education and Culture Forum and a research fellow at the Institute of Contemporary History, Universidad Nova de Lisboa. Carolina is the executive editor of the Contemporary Journal and has published in international journals such as King's Review and Wrong. From 2017 to 2019, she was the head of public programs and research at Nottingham Contemporary, leading the partnership with Nottingham Trent University and University of Nottingham. Turn over. Got loads. She holds a PhD in curatorial knowledge from Goldsmiths University of London, where she also taught from 2014 to 2016. She lectures internationally in Europe, South America, and the Middle East on research and curatorial studies. Recent and related projects include Black Arts Movement in Coventry, which explored the unique and exceptional role of Coventry and the Midlands in the foundation of the British Black Art Movement in the 1980s. Although underrepresented in the local art scene, art-related syllabi and prevailing local narrative, Coventry was home to a paradigm shift in British art history. Black Arts Movement in Coventry celebrated this legacy via workshops, a series of talks, and a working group engaging local black and ethnic minority artists and academics. The project explored this history and its contemporary resonances. Furthermore, in 2020, Carolina and the Centre for Arts, Memory and Communities launched a fully funded PhD scholarship for Black curating and institutional change. The PhD project aims to investigate the understudied curatorial framework of the British Black art movement in the 1980s and the role of the Herbert Gallery Museum in promoting and supporting the movement. The second discussion, chaired by myself, picks up on the themes of legacy in relation to the Black Art Group and the Black Art Movement. The Black Art Group Public Art Commission has been instigated by Birmingham 2022 Cultural Festival during the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. The Commission commemorates the 40th anniversary of the first National Black Arts Convention convened by the Black Art Group in 1982, as well as the wider impact the group has had artistically, academically, and socio-politically. The discussion on public art is likely to touch on themes of cancel culture, such as the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol, suggesting there is a need for debate on who, how, and what is memorialised. Within these tensions, the conversation will address what might be produced by the commissioned artists and what might be the public's reaction. We are honoured to have Janine Bethina, Creative Director of Coventry City of Culture Trust, as one of our contributors to this discussion, alongside Craig Ashley, Associate Head of School, Enterprise and Innovation, Coventry University, and I will be inviting further contributions from Marlene and Keith during that conversation. Where am I? Okay, so the format for today's events is the first discussion will take place for about 50 minutes, and then we'll be open up for questions for about 30 minutes. So, and because we're probably running a bit over time, we're probably going to have to squeeze it in, so maybe I should have shut up a long time ago. So I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Carolina, invite Keith and Marlene to take their seats on the stage. I think you're going to be sat over there, and you're going to be doing a bit of pass the mic.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that this is a quite unique moment to have Marlene Smith and Keith Piper here at the Herbert in conversation with us, and the opportunity for us to be talking about the show in 1983. That's the...
We're getting some instructions from the...
Could you just shuffle in a little bit?
The person with the really bright lights.
That's the interference. That's the start of
Yeah, this is the...
Are we good now?
May you just go in a little bit on the side?
Oh, no, I don't need to be in shot. Yeah, I don't need to be in shot. It's them. It's them.
Okay. So, is it okay now? So as I was saying, it's a great opportunity to have the chance to talk with Marlene and Keith about the show in 1983, the Pan-Afrikan Connection that took place here at the Herbert. Was also a touring show. There were other venues, but what I would invite Marlene and Keith to do today with us is to reflect upon the experience of that show back in '83. I will introduce shortly Marlene and Keith. I'm aware that you all know their work very well, but important to say that their work contribution to the British art scene has been incredibly revolutionary. We are in the presence of two people that work together with other colleagues as well that have changed the paradigm of British art since the 80s and until today, and very much active as well, and so in various fields, not only as artists themselves, but also as curators and researchers. So Marlene Smith, if I may, is an artist, curator, researcher, who is a founding member of the BLK Art Group, and we will talk a little bit more about that as well. Marlene is also someone that has exhibited her work extensively, locally, nationally, and internationally, and also dedicated part of her career to curatorial projects. And we will also touch on some of these practices, especially looking at the 80s, namely the BLK Art Gallery in Finsbury Park and other iterations. So important to say that Marlene also more recently was the curator of the public, but also continues her research and contribution to the field also as an associate of the project in Preston that is led by Robena Hinnett. I may say that also Marlene was one of the research managers for the HRC project, Black Artists and Modernism, and this is a project that was funded, if I'm not mistaken, between 2017, 2016
2015 to 18.
So 15 to 18, and was led by Professor Sonia Boyce, and also involving other colleagues such as Paul Goodwin, David DeBosa, etc. And you can find more information about these projects online as well if you are interested. So now Keith Piper extensively exhibited his work locally, but also as Marlene nationally, internationally. Is someone that has had an amazing impact in the, say, post-medium practices, in artistic practices in the UK, but also internationally. Keith Piper since 2006 has joined Middlesex University as an associate professor in fine arts, but your academic iterations also go back to some experience also in the US and also in the UK. Also a founding member of the BLK Art Group. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that, and someone that has a very extensive practice as well in thinking and reflecting upon the practices of the black art in this country. And if you visit the website, that is really a very important asset, keithpiper.info, you will find a lot of information about your practice, but not exclusively. Also, some of the artist commentaries, which is an absolutely amazing format that I think you find as a way to communicate and reflect on the things that are happening in the field, and also considering the social political background. So not only the artistic side, but also how it's situated in a broader scenario. So thank you so much for being here today. I also wanted to thank Ian for the invitation. Ian, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, just on time. And what I would like to do today, as I said, is to focus on the exhibition in 1983. But before I do that, just to get us started, I would like to ask you both, given that you were growing, being brought up, say, in the 70s in this country, and there's so many things happening in that decade. I think of the slowing down of the swinging 60s, for instance. We can discuss about that. I think about the beginning of Thatcherism as well, but also some other kind of more legal issues that are being discussed at that moment, related to, for instance, the Immigration Act, which is a gesture towards making more difficult the arrival of people from South Asia, Africa, and also the Caribbean. So it's a quite intense decade. And I wanted to ask you what it was for you to grow up during that decade, and the decision to follow an artistic career, so or at least to study arts. So what is the connection between these two things?
Right, that's quite a difficult question. So I'll confess to you, first of all, that I was born in the middle of the 60s. So the 70s for me were a formative time of literally growing into adulthood. So my decision to study art didn't come until 82. I literally, and 82 was also the year that I met Keith and the others in the Black Art Group. So those things really converge and happen at the same time. And even though I wasn't old enough really to have a handle on the global politics, the thing that I think about when I think back to that time, I think about SOS, and I don't know whether I'm getting my timing right, because what I was really aware of was how difficult it was to inhabit the inner cities, which is where I was born in Birmingham. So I was very aware of the relationship between young black people and the police, for example. But I was trying to educate myself in terms of understanding what Pan-Africanism was. The show that the first show that I ever saw of the Black Art Group, and it's, instead of BLK, it is Black. That's how we pronounce it. The Black Art Group. The first show that I saw was at the Icon in Birmingham. And that was in the summer of 1982. So I was about to turn 18. And I was...
sorry.
Is he making faces?
I am making faces because of the whole age thing, which is blowing my mind now. And so you were actually 17?
I was 17.
Oh my goodness.
When I
talking to a 17-year-old like that. Oh.
I was 17 when I first saw that work.
Oh my goodness, okay.
But I saw the work because I was already on a quest to find something that would make sense of my ambitions. Because I did have an ambition to do something creative. I hadn't quite put my finger on what that would be. And as part of my A-level studies, we were required to do a bit of independent research, and I chose to do my independent research on black artists. So at 16, 17, when I was talking to my school teachers, my art teachers at school, about what I wanted to do, they were worried on my behalf that I wouldn't find any black artists. And that was the feedback that I got from them. They weren't being very anti, but they were saying to me, "Are you sure that this is a subject that you'll find any material for?" And so some months later, to be invited, to get an invitation to go to the Icon to see this show was incredible. And I always say that it was when I saw the poster for that. So what happened was that somebody sent me the poster for the 1982 Icon Gallery show. And those of you that haven't seen it, it's on the Black Art Group website. Black Art Group, what is it? blackartgroup.info?
Oh, God, I've gone completely blank now. It's a Black Art Group research project, 2012. And it's on the website. There is a section of posters and ephemera and
so there was a black poster with white lettering, and there were several comments by members of the group. And I remember one said, "Let us make our art an ensign around which to rally the people." So it was that kind of a rhetorical strength in those statements. And I do remember that the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I read that poster. And so it kind of galvanized me into action. And when I went to the show, I met Keith, and he recruited me. I like using that term.
At the age of 17.
At the age of 17. He recruited me by inviting me to come to the next Black Art Group meeting, and that's how I kind of got involved.
Keith, do you want to?
I mean, this has really emphasised the kind of fact that actually Marlene was the kind of youngest. You were the youngest.
Sorry, can I just?
And I'm significantly older than her because I was born in 1960, which meant that that coming into the 70s was really my what's the word? Informative era, just in terms of from growing up as a teenager through the events of like 75, Notting Hill Riot, all those kind of things. And it's really fantastic to actually be here in Coventry, because Coventry, I mean, it's really fascinating how important this particular site is to the evolution of those ideas. I mean, when I say that big site, I arrived here in '79 at the age of 18, and met Eddie Chambers for the foundation course. We got into this conversation, but But the foundation course at that time was really interesting, and Coventry was a fascinating place. The foundation course, because we had individuals like Art and John here, who absolutely, was really clear about the relationship between his politics and painting, and opened up those kind of possibilities, for all of us. But also, what was really important in Coventry at that time was what was happening here in terms of popular culture, because the whole rock against racism thing, the whole idea that you could use contemporary and popular music as a political tool had already gathered pace through the mid-70s. But it was here very, very specifically in the two-tone moment where you had this kind of, these young musicians who were bringing out of the archive, this Jamaican style and merging it with a kind of punk sensibility and making a music which was very specific to the UK at that time, but very, very specific to Coventry. And at that time, a lot of the venues here, and I remember as a student going to somewhere called the Downstairs Bar, I don't know, it obviously doesn't exist, it was underneath the Students' Union somewhere. And they had all these incredible bands there, and there was a pub called the Hope and Anchor. I hope I got that right, because I don't think we called it that. We called it some rhyming couplet, which I won't go into. And there were these amazing, these local bands. The Specials, the Selector, this incredible band called the MPs. All of these were like local people, combining white aesthetics with the black aesthetics being really political. And both Eddie and myself went to all these gigs. We were actually rude boys, if you can believe that. Yeah. The whole thing, you see me and now, all this scruffiness. Back in the day, it was all the suits and all that kind of stuff. And we were, as two young students, into that scene. Mm-hmm. So this whole idea that you could construct a political moment out of the lived experiences of people here, which was also political, which interestingly was a kind of multiracial one. Mm-hmm. It was black politically, but it was also multiracial. And I think that actually marked a lot of the developments. And so I think Coventry is really important. I'm sorry that I actually missed, because there was a show here about two-tone, wasn't there?
Yes.
Which I missed. I can't believe it's there. So I'm really happy now that there is a lot of work happening in looking at that moment, because I think it is really important and key. I think we sort of, when we left Coventry, we sort of moved slightly politically, especially when I went to Artington, which is a different kind of space. And also Coventry moved and shifted, which is also this really interesting and almost scary story, because it became a really risky place to be. I remember sometime in the early to mid 80s, Coventry shifted quite radically, and we saw signs of that shift back in 79 and 80, but it really became marked. But
can I ask you a question about the formation of the Black Art Group, and specifically about that context that you just described of meeting any chambers here in Coventry in 79 and then being exposed to the popular culture scene here in Coventry, and I think a little bit of that vibe also had to do with the nature of how the music scene expresses itself, which tends to be through groups, not exclusively, but bands, people being part of a band, hanging out. And I always wonder about the need or the reason why the Black Art Group is a group. And the question is, you could have gone about the same kind of practice as individual artists and sharing certain affinities and concerns, but you decided to create a group. I wonder, also having kind of a background, the Turner Prize now here at the Herbert that has exclusively collectives, I wonder how you read that. Why did you feel that the group was the way to tackle or that suited better, I think, what you had to do and the move that you were really producing in what black art not what it was, but what you wanted it to be?
I think for me, there was a search. There's a search for community, and the Black Art Group became that community for me in the first instance, and then later on, via the Black Art Group, I met other communities of artists. But it was really a search for community. I mean, even back when I was 17, 18, trying to find other black artists, it's the same instinct, it's the same impulse, which is to find context. And I think growing up in the UK at that time, one was always being reminded of how one didn't fit in. You know, there was constant reminders of that. And so the community that I belonged to was my family, my intimate family, so my parents and my cousins. I had that community, but that community didn't understand why I wanted to listen to John Peel. John Peel? Yeah. John Peel on the radio.
Yes, John Peel. Everybody remembers John Peel. John Peel, yes.
Or understand some of those other kind of nuances of growing up and creating an identity. So I think for me, the collective was a way of increasing and growing context and finding community. And I always say that the Black Art Group was not the reason that I went to art school, but it was the reason that I managed to stay in art school and finish my studies. And I think that if I'd been there by myself, without that context, it would have been a much more difficult set of, a much more difficult experience for me. And so, and I think that is that need, that understanding that when you can see yourself reflected in others, and also what happens when you do find that context and that community is that you have different types of conversations. Sometimes the conversations will be really surprising, and you're going to get to stuff that you didn't even know was a question. But that's what for me, that's what the group does. It creates context and it creates community.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. The idea of community and the idea of community was really important. There was also, though, this kind of really, really practical and pragmatic reason for getting together as a group, and that was it was a more efficient way of making the work visible. When I met Eddie Chambers here, he was already working on a group show of young artists who were his friends from Bilston Art College or something like that. And he was already curating this show, and I only got involved with the show because I overheard him talking to somebody else about the show. I'm doing this show, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, Eddie, what's this show? And it was really irritating that I had overheard as well, because he grudgingly explained about the show, and I said, can I be involved? Yeah, okay. And so, began to kind of go to the meetings, which he was having in his house, in his dad's house, in Wolverhampton. And that was the group, which, because they were initially working on an exhibition, I think it was Middlesex Art Gallery. But then I think they had the opportunity to switch it to Wolverhampton Art Gallery, which is a more, visible venue. So that it went with that, and that was then the first show, the show called Black Art and Done, which happened in 1981, I think. 1981. And that was, all the artists that Eddie had been working with in terms of his friends from his. What was it called? A-levels? A-levels.
It was A-levels.
Yeah, I think it was. See, it was a long time ago. I'm an old man, I can't remember. And it was myself and a few up here. And and it's really interesting then how this group, this collective then evolved. Because some of the original members left on after that show, most significantly Claudette Johnson, who was an art student there in Wolverhampton, joined. Then I met Marlene, then I met Ed there, and I met Ed and Donald. You know, so it became, you know, but yes, this whole idea of both a group as a practical thing, a practical way of getting things done. I think it's something which is really interesting because it's been repeated time and time again. And when I speak to students, I always say, you know, there's a history of young artists getting together and forming groups as a way of, you know, mutual support, strategic thinking, all that kind of thing. You know, we can even speak about the kind of Freeze show, the show which made the YBAs as a collective, and obviously now in terms of the Turner Prize, we're seeing these collectives. So it's really interesting. But I really do agree with what Marlene will say about the importance, especially at that time when we were all aware that we were relatively isolated in our various art schools. There would have been one or two other black students or whatever. And to kind of come together and have that conversation was really important. So yes, it's perfect.
So the group in a way plays a lot of different roles.
Yes.
Its community is a support structure. It's also a practical, as a practical angle, but it was also important to get the show the works disseminated. So on that particular note around the exhibitions, as you were saying, 81 in Wolverhampton, there's the Black Art Undone, and I've heard some of your comments around what happened to that show then to change a little bit to what the Pan-African Connection, and this is a way for us to kind of enter into the topic of the Pan-African Connection exhibition. So if I may, before we start, we talk about the Pan-African Connection, shall we just have a bit of a sense of how the group was also organizing the shows? So how did you put together, for instance, the first one, and is it that you showed in Wolverhampton and then you thought, okay, let's have a different kind of exhibition, or because of new members entering the group? What was defining, in a way, the different exhibitions that you then
I think it was
doing?
the evolving work and the evolving lineup. Because there were new artists coming in. The artists that were in the group had, you know, we were all art students, so we were making work constantly. I think the significant jump from Wolverhampton to the second show, because the second show was at the Africa Centre.
Africa Centre.
Was it? So was Africa Centre before Icon?
I think so. It's 81, yes.
See, I'm really frustrated now because I have the scrapbook there and I can't actually remember, you know, but yes, I'm not sure if it was.
Documentation says that Africa Centre was the first venue, 81 still.
Right.
The second one is Icon in Birmingham.
Okay.
82.
Which is what I saw.
And then there's a mention to Bristol, which I don't know the venue.
Yeah, King Street Gallery.
Okay. And then finally in 83, there's the first one in Nottingham in January.
Oh, that's at
The Midland Group.
And then finally here in February.
Okay.
So it's a very short period of time between the Nottingham and the Coventry one, which happens, I think the Coventry is the last one, the last iteration of the Pan-African.
I'm sure it's not, but it might be. But I'm sure it is.
So what about
there are others?
the Art Centre?
No. But yes, exactly. There were
There
were a range of shows after that.
Yeah.
The Coventry one came almost
in
in
the... used the title Pan-African Connection then. That might be the difference between...
I don't think we ever didn't use that title after we started to use it.
Right.
And then there were these shows after the Black Art Group itself sort of drifted apart, which were called Beyond the Pan-African Connection.
Before we get there,
That was your Donald.
Before we get to A4 and like,
Sorry.
Get
Some of
ahead
this
of
was getting,
ourselves.
yeah. And
let's talk about the Coventry exhibition.
Okay.
Yes. So, what do you remember? How did you learn about it? That there was a conversation about this?
So what would happen was that we were meeting regularly. We did have very regular meetings. I think they were about once a month. And we had minutes. We were very organized. We had minutes and agendas and everything. And one of the constant issues on our agendas was always about where the next shows were going to be. And so I think that Eddie was the person that would contact venues suggesting that they might like to have a show by the Black Art Group. But we would have the discussions about what was happening with that on a regular basis. So Eddie would have told us at one of the meetings that there was going to be a show at Coventry, that had been arranged, and then the conversation would go something along the lines of, what are you going to show? So, as Keith has said, we were already in art college, where we were constantly making things, and our practices were evolving as any art students would. But it was really down to the individual to decide what they would show. It wasn't that we did a group crit and decided which pieces to show. It was more that we were in we refer back to our own evolution. And I remember Coventry particularly well because it was the first time that I'd shown the Black Art Group. So that was one of the memories that and I was terrified because I was still on my foundation course. And so when the question would be asked at the meeting, who's got work for the show, and then when it come to me, I would be like, I'm not sure if I'm ready for this. But the group had an expectation. There was an expectation there that if you're going to be part of this group, you're going to take part in the exhibitions. And also, there's an expectation there in terms of it being a space where you're allowed to grow. So I always found my colleagues in the Black Art Group very supportive of that development. And I think it's something that we haven't really spoken about very much, but having that community that is wishing you well and wanting you to move forward with your practice was really important. The other things that I remember about the Coventry show are the controversy. So I'm sure we'll come to this, but there was a moment where we had to, which tested us, I think, really, in terms of our solidarity, because one of the pieces of work in the exhibition, I think we were asked initially to take the piece down, and we had a conversation and all agreed that we would not do that, even though at the time there was a risk. I think we thought there was a risk that we'd be asked to that the whole show would be abandoned, but we decided that we wanted to stick with our colleagues. So that's something, I think, of all the things that I remember about the Coventry show, that particular incident and the fallout of that incident is strongest in my mind. But also, I think just the overwhelming sense of the power of the work. It was a really beautiful show. And for me, showing amongst my colleagues for the first time, that it was a way of seeing my work in context. And I think anybody who exhibits understands what that's like. It's one thing to be in your studio or your making space with a piece of work, and a completely different experience to see that work next to, your colleagues and your peers. I also remember Lubain Hamid coming to give a talk. I remember something about, I don't remember all the exact words that she used, but I remember the feeling of that exchange. And it really was an exchange between her. She's slightly older than us, even older than Keith.
Just slightly, yeah.
And so there was a sense that she was already established in a practice. And so to have her words of encouragement and her words of critique was really significant. And I remember things like, on the opening night, we had a sound system. So it's really interesting. It was Andrew Campbell and the Turbo.
Yes, I remember that in.
So Turbo Black Arts was a group that was set up and run in Nottingham. Because Keith and Donald were at Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham, that's where the connection came from them.
Yeah.
And they came from Nottingham with their big sound system speaker boxes and set up in this building. And we had the noisiest opening that probably Herbert Gallery had ever had, probably still to this day, if we had to check the decibels. So I remember that and I just remember it felt, what's the word that Claudette uses? I can't remember now. But it was invigorating. It was fantastic to find yourself at the heart of something like that, you know.
Can I just pick up on that? Because Marlene, for some reason, your name is not included in the small publication you issued for the exhibition. So there's very little information about your contribution. Could you tell us more, including the work you're showing?
I really wish I had a clearer memory. I can only guess at what work I was showing in that show because there's no document. As I said, there's no documentation. The reason that my name wasn't included is because when we had the meeting and Eddie was asking who's going to be in the show, I wasn't 100% committed to showing. I was still quite nervous about showing. And so I made the decision to exhibit quite late in the day. And obviously when you're printing things, you have deadlines. So I missed the deadlines. In terms of what I showed, I have a piece of work called, it's called The Most Sacred Commandment. And if you'd like to see an image of that work, when we did, in 2012, the Black Art Group Research Project did a 30th anniversary conference at Wolverhampton. And that is documented on the same blackartgroup.info website. And there are images of that work because Robin Mercer talks about that work in terms of it being work from the early 80s. And it definitely was made in 1983. So, and that piece of work was an image of I think it's called an aqua cuba doll. It's a doll that is made of wood. It has a large kind of moon-shaped face and tiny little arms and legs. And it's a fertility doll. So, and I remember making that work because I'd been playing with these ideas around representation. And at the time, I was really interested in using objects rather than making representations of the body. And so this doll is a fertility doll. And so I used the doll and I used some lettering, some cotton mix lettering from what used to be called Letraset. Do they still have Letraset?
Letraset is coming back.
Is it? Okay. So I just cut out the letters to form the words, the most sacred commandment. And then, so the work reads, the most sacred commandment violated. So I was trying to suggest a relationship between that particular image and the history of colonialism and slavery, particularly that history in relation to black women's bodies, without using black women's bodies. And the reason for not wanting to use the bodies is because either there's been a long-standing conversation that black artists have with each other in community about the extent to which the black body in pain is overused. So I think that's what I showed. But I may have also shown some much more rudimentary images, because I do remember, like every art student that's ever been through an art college, I remember sticking my head in the photocopy machine. I'm sure that everybody has, you know, sticking your head in that photocopy machine and making whatever image you have. I am almost 100% sure that I would have had an image of that type in the show, right at the beginning of that journey.
Can you recall how the show was? So what was the curatorial say, or the juxtapositions? Because your work was at the center of these controversies.
Actually, but it wasn't physically at the center. It was physically.
Well,
if this was the room,
It was,
it was in that corner.
Yeah, there was a piece which, according to a lot of the press that you can look at now, was one of the pieces at the centre of the conversation. There was another one apparently by Eddie with a picture of the Queen, and the way it describes it in the press clippings is the Queen with blood coming out of her mouth. And then there's another piece which was described as disrespectful to black women. Now all these things were picked up. I am actually not sure which piece. The interesting thing about this show, and to us, the whole curatorial things, that the thing which I recall in terms of the hanging of the show was that it had come alongside, there had been a number of shows, as you say, which had just recently happened. So in a sense, we were almost used to, putting this work up. And I think for the first time we got all the work into the space, and there was more work than space. And I remember there was a conversation about what we should leave out. And I remember that there was a particular piece of mine which was the Black Sassing Saints. And the curator was saying, why don't we leave out this piece? Because it's too big and it's too ugly and that kind of stuff. And then people say, no, that's an important piece, you have to leave that. And so there's this other conversation about why particular work should be in the show and what could be left out. And I think that was one of the first times that we'd actually had that kind of conversation. There was then the controversy which we can get to, but I want to get to the Lubaina thing because that was really interesting. Now, the important thing, Lubaina, who was currently at the Royal College at that time, also wrote a review of the show in Art Monthly, which I need to go back and have a read of. It's really important. And also, this artist called Joseph Lubu, who was also a really important artist, curator of the time. He did this show called New Horizons, which was one of those, the kind of classic survey shows of the 80s. So he was a really important voice, so to speak, in the past, unfortunately, because he's passed away. However, the Lubaina, I remember in a room like this, as a meek and fragile youth, with Lubaina, and the first thing that Lubaina said in her critique of the show was, I've never seen so many beaten black bodies. You, Kid Piper, your work is full of beaten black bodies, or words to
something
that.
Like that. I'm sure she puts it more delicately than that.
She never put it no delicately. There's not delicate about it.
I do remember that moment.
Yeah, and I was too scared to respond. I wanted to kind of say, well, there's this other piece and that other piece, and so, but I didn't because I was too scared.
I do remember that. It did feel. So for me personally, you go to art college and you want a critique. You want your tutor and your fellow students to come into your space and say something about what you're making. And I found that in my college at Bradford, I wasn't getting that, because I think sometimes the tutors and the students were a bit intimidated by the images. So an image like that piece that I've described to you, would leave them speechless rather than start a conversation. It would seem to be the end of a conversation rather than the beginning of one. And so what I felt happened when Lubaina came to see us in this space is that we had the critique that we would have liked to have had at our college, or certainly that's how it felt to me. And she was saying, bringing a perspective to the work that we hadn't had before. Because as soon as she said that, however she phrased it, that the show was full of beaten bodies, it makes you understand that because you're working, maybe perhaps because we're working in isolation in art college, we're making work with the art college as in our heads as the recipient, rather than thinking about a wider ecology of viewers.
It also points to that and think that at that time, in general, there wasn't a lot of conversation about the work. It was really, I mean, most of the meetings that ever happened, people would be talking about the funding, who's showing what galleries are doing, this, that, and the other. But there was very little spaces in which we as black artists would actually scrutinise work, would actually talk about the work. I think that has changed, has begun to change. But at that time, I think that kind of conversation was absent. That is why it's so interesting when you then listen to the recordings of the first National Convention, when Claudette did her presentation about her work. And there was like almost a struggle for people to begin to talk about work, because we weren't used to it.
But I think that there's an ongoing thing where particularly when you start talking about black art, even today, there is a tendency to talk about the socio-political rather than the aesthetic. You know, it's a kind of default position that we get there rather than talking about what the image is doing or not doing. We talk about the social and political context of the work, which is important, but it you know, it's only one aspect of the work we're producing.
That's definitely something that you've done with the Black Artists in Modernism project, was to look at the work.
That was one of the central tenets of that project, where we all got together, was that we would absolutely focus on the work itself.
So if I can ask you, if you remember where in this building you were showing the Pan-African Connection, would you be able to tell us?
That's a painful thing, because every time I come into this building, I'm thinking
it's different.
Someone
The gallery was over there.
Yeah,
over there to the right.
It was the top of the stairs. I remember the stairs.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember the stairs.
I was coming up the stairs. So is that one just?
You know, just straight
Down
through.
the corridor,
Straight
right?
through and turn right.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, yes.
But it's
So it
all
was one
changed. The
gallery.
entrance is different places.
Yeah, it hasn't changed. I mean, that's the thing. Yeah, but I can recall the stairs, and obviously this building has been transformed since then with all the
Yes, absolutely.
rebuilding and stuff. So yes.
So it's important to contextualize when you talk about Marlene's presentation, that there was also a series of public events being organized alongside the exhibition.
Yeah.
You also had Eric Hamilton, if I'm not mistaken, coming to introduce the show for the opening. And then there was in March, documentation says, on the 9th of March, and this is after the controversy. So you organized a series of public conversations involving Donald Rodney is one of the speakers, but also Lubena Himid. And there's a panel specifically about the controversy. If documentation is...
I have zero recollection of that, unfortunately. I have zero recollection of lots of things. But
There's a correspondence between Patrick Day, the curator here.
oh, Patrick Day, yes.
Yeah.
I remember Patrick Day very clearly. I have a very clear image of him. But I just don't remember. I thought that we did a series of smaller talks. I remember being in a room showing slides, and the slide projector malfunctioned. So that's why I remember about it. I just remember, just wanting the earth to swallow me up. But I don't remember a panel discussion with.
Maybe it would be interesting to know if it actually happened. There was a correspondence says that it was planned, and Claudette was also invited to present here the same presentation she did in Wolverhampton, but ended up not doing it because found that the audience she would have to work on the presentation. It couldn't be just the same one. But she says, but I'm happy to join the panel discussion in the afternoon.
This sounds fascinating. And so you've seen this documentation?
This is part of the Herbert's archive.
This is in the Herbert archive?
Yes.
We need to have a look at this.
Absolutely.
You see how they're keeping these things secret and, you know,
all
who's Herbert?
digitized.
Who's the Herbert person?
It was all, it was digitized by Ian actually. So
Oh, you see this now? He keeps it secret. Well, before in advance of this, you show us all this stuff. You have it, but we don't. What do you think? Wait, send it to me. You lost my address or something.
But just to say that it's important to no, I mean just the point being like having a public events, not having only the exhibition, but thinking that more than that it's important to have discussions, presentations, conversations. Also, just to add to that, it seems like Patrick Day was also organizing, and I'm not sure if you also you contributed to that. Was some of the film screenings. But maybe that's something that he was organizing independently, but informing Eddie Chambers through the correspondence. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see the importance of precisely having these platforms alongside the exhibition, in a way having exhibition as a prompt to have these conversations, and also thinking of how important it is today as well in institutions such as the Herbert and others, to have these kind of conversations?
It's essential. I think that the work would be, the work itself is important, but without these types of events, there's no contextualization. And certainly from my point of view, the events are also opportunities to meet people, to have the kinds of conversations that you wouldn't have dreamt of, that you can't dream up by yourself. So I think that having some kind of program that activates the work and activates the space and activates the conversation is really important.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting that those things were seen as really important then, and now they're seen as crucial. You know, everything that you do, there has to be some kind of social context, conversations with various groups, etc. And I think that's incredibly important, obviously, and we understand it's important. What has also emerged here as really important is the archive. Because I had no idea that this archive existed, and I want to see it now because I love to collect archive stuff, like my own. But it's to kind of see these other archives. And of course, the great hidden archive is Eddie Chambers' archive, which is going to will be revealed to the world one day. It's a 20-volume set or something.
I'm aware of time, and I'm sure there will be many questions from the audience. I just wanted to ask one last question, if I may. And this is about kind of how you see these debates today. And obviously we are not in the 70s or in the 80s any longer. Things changed. Maybe they changed in many ways, but also other things haven't changed that much. We are in a in the last 18 months, these conversations became even more topical because the unfortunate death of George Floyd in the hands of the police in the US, and the re-emergence, in a way, of the Black Lives Matter movement, and how institutions, contemporary art institutions and others, are also thinking about what they should be doing with their archives, with their programming, with their workforce, with their audiences. The term black back then, in the 80s when you're writing, was such a galvanizer, as you were saying, and it was the term that brought together a lot of people that were identified under that term. Things have eventually changed as well, because when you write, Keith, you always mention South Asian, African, and Caribbean people, and I'm talking about the 80s. So how do you think, and I'm thinking of young people as well, and what to do with these debates? How is the term black still topical, and how do you think that is a political tool, an aesthetic tool today?
I was interested to kind of think about the conversation around the use of the term black in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and how that really was a sort of conversation between people who saw it as a collective political term, which would describe, you know, people of African descent, Caribbean descent, Asian descent, and people who were arguing that it was much more specific to people of African descent. So we'd have that kind of conversation with things like the Black Art Gallery. The Black Art Gallery, very specifically, when they were formed, they saw the term black as being of African descent. And then it was changed to, and we had a radical generation of new art directors who kind of changed what the Black Art Gallery sort of did. It's interesting because it's the first time that someone has mentioned that kind of shift between how the term black was used then and the use of the term black in terms of Black Lives Matter. Obviously, Black Lives Matter comes from a different context, and you know, it's a movement which is doing some really important work in terms of the focusing of the debate. I think it's interesting because it comes from the United States very much so, where the frame of the term black has been different and specific. Well, it's the first time I've actually thought about it in that context, in the context of Black Lives Matter meaning very specifically people of African descent. And does it?
I think in terms of Black Lives Matter, it does. That's what it means. And it doesn't seem to be contested within that context of Black Lives Matter. I'm constantly being asked this question though, about whether, when people refer now, when they talk to me about my politics, they tell me that it's political black, as opposed to black. There's this differentiation made by younger generations when they're trying to explain the difference. So it's something that I have to accept rather than something that I feel like I'm involved in formulating, because I don't feel as though anything has happened that would make me want to change my politics and my political outlook. In 1982, in October 1982, Rashid Doreen came to Wolverhampton with a really important message around art and black consciousness. And he delivered that paper at the convention in 1982, and it made sense to me as a soon-to-be 18-year-old. And it still makes sense to me now that I'm soon to be a lot older than an 18-year-old. And so I don't feel a need to adjust my antennae. But I do find that there's a slightly different conversation happening with the younger generation. And I kind of have to leave it to them to decide whether what I'm saying now and what I have been saying and what I continue to say is relevant or not. You know, as an artist, I want my work to be pertinent to the moment that it's made, to be about today and not to be looking back, either in a sort of nostalgia sense or in any other kind of sense. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's definitely an ongoing question as well. So again, well, thank you so much for very generously engaging with the questions. And now I think to open to questions from you, comments, anything, really just raise your hand and feel free to. Yes, sure.
Sorry. Could I say that having two black students on the foundation course was actually extremely unusual. I mean, prior to this, we always had Asian students, particularly female Asian students, but black students were pretty rare, and I think I can't remember any or many before Keith and Eddie. And in a sense, all it took was Keith and Eddie to actually change the world. But I think things are different now. I mean, I presume they are.
I'm trying to remember my interview panel.
Yeah.
But you weren't on it, though, were you?
I don't know, I can't remember.
Yeah. And there was
John
another
Hosmer.
one. What?
John Hosmer.
Yes, John. Yeah, and a few others. Yes.
I
yes.
think
And so it's interesting in terms of just how, because the interview panels are obviously really important places, because the people that end up on the course
Yes,
are
sure,
not necessarily
sure, yes.
all the people who
Yes,
apply. And
yes.
so, was there in some moment, you know, because there obviously were young black art, because there was a whole generation of people who were slightly older than us,
Yes, yes, sure.
who so they must have been, and they were coming through the art school system.
Yes, yes.
So it's just
Yeah.
kind of quite interesting
Yes.
where they.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think that Asian families supported their daughters and doing art and design, but I think black students had specific kind of problems and issues of whether that was supported.
Yeah, problems and issues. I think if you think about our generation, generations of people like myself who had come through the kind of primary school, secondary school education, and were interested in art, now then we would have been starting to. I mean, it's interesting because for the first time in the year after myself at Trent Polytechnic, there were loads of black students.
Right.
For some reason,
Yeah.
and Donald Rodney was one of them, and others were there. So it seemed to kind of shift, and now being involved in education, one of the things which actually fascinates me is the shifting demographics of students on a year-to-year basis.
Right.
Like, you can never quite understand why, in a particular year, there are loads of black students, and another year is different, and you know, and it does shift, it does change. This year's intake of students.
Can you speak more specifically about the actual experience of art school? Because like something that you were saying, Marlene, was about, you know, when it was about the work itself, it was ending of conversations. I wanted to kind of get more of an idea of what was it like? What were you doing? You know, what work were you producing that kind of ended conversations or created conversations? What were you seeing going and experiencing in the galleries itself or elsewhere that was influencing your practice at the time?
What can I say to you? Being an art student in the 80s, certainly, what would happen is that you would be designated a space, which was your territory, and you'd have a sort of team leader who was your tutor, and you'd be in a tutorial group of maybe 12 or 15 other students. And the idea was that you would use that territory as your laboratory where you'd be making art. And the idea is that by having all of the students together, that you'd be rubbing up against each other, and that would be your community of discussion. I think for me personally, and I do want to make this a very personal comment, because you know, everybody has a different experience. That didn't work for me. I found myself constantly moving away from the space, that physical space. And that was because I wasn't comfortable there. And I wasn't comfortable there because I wasn't made to feel comfortable there. And that may also have something to do with the fact that I was looking for the political. I was really actively engaged in looking for a way of making work that wasn't shy about its politics. And I think that my tutors in Bradford differed. Some of them, there were tutors that seemed to pick up on that and enjoy that and want to engage in that conversation. But for the most part, they didn't. They seemed to find that territory that I was digging up difficult. And I think the kind of wider conversations out in the world around race were not terribly sophisticated at that time. When I'm talking about what you would read in the newspapers and what would be in the kind of popular culture, were not very particularly sophisticated. So they didn't have the language with which to engage in a conversation with me about what I was doing, and they didn't have the nerve or they weren't sufficiently radical to take a leap of faith into that into that unknown territory. One of the things that comes up often when I'm in conversation with people about art colleges and how they have or haven't changed is the extent to which the medium was supposed to tell you whether an artist is political or not. So, for example, there's this whole thing about using screen-based media, time-based media. And there's a kind of expectation that if you're time-based media, then you're political, and if you're painting, then you're not political. And the Black Art Group really butts up against that because the work is incredibly painterly. There's, you know, the piece of work that got criticised of Keith that allegedly had the Queen bleeding from the mouth.
That was
Eddie Chambers, sorry. But you know, that would have been an image that we would have seen over and over again in terms of punk, in terms of, can't think who, but you know, there's a famous image, God bless the Queen. Sex Pistols. So all of those types of, sorry, I'm getting lost in the question now. So I personally felt as though I was a problem for my tutors. They didn't quite know what to do with me. And I needed more than they could give me. Because you know, as an art student, undergraduate student, you're really hungry for feedback. And as Keith said, the Black Art Group didn't exactly provide feedback because we didn't have group crits. We were meeting initially at Eddie Chambers' parents' home, and then after that at the Cultural Centre in Wolverhampton. And the meetings were much more about the meat and potatoes of it. Are we going to do this show? Who have we written to us? Who is going to be in the show? That kind of a thing.
We have two comments here, so if you could start. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious to find out, like, on an emotional level, how did it feel to do the work, to create the work in this period? Because I'm the only black student on the MA course, in the MA Fine Art course.
MA Fine Art where? Here?
At Wolverhampton.
And how large is the cohort?
There's not too many. She's the only one in her course on photography. I'm the only MA Fine Art. But last year on my BA course, I kind of went a little bit, and I've never really too dabbled that way before, but I kind of went a little bit into migration, a little bit, along the political side, and it drained me. I really didn't enjoy doing the work. I couldn't wait for it to be over. And starting to do my MA, I was like totally disregarding all of that kind of stuff, and I just want to do something different. So I want to know, how did you stay in that zone, to do so much work? Because I struggle.
Can you just get
I find it depressing
as well? Just a word type. Do you want to?
It's kind of a part of that. I mean, my answer to that one was I was searching. I was just exactly the same. So I'd come here and I to Coventry University, and I first started with paintings first, and then eventually I started to read my own African history. And my colleague here, who was my mate at the time, saw me reading, thinking I was punishing myself, but I wasn't. I was actually digging and delving to find out who I was. And so the search wasn't as draining. I find it draining now, explaining about my identity, but at the time it was trying to find out more and more and more, so I was hungry for it. It was difficult on the course because being only that person there, all 3 years. But I did have one tutor who's John, who was good, who said he'd kind of get excited when he saw the images I was producing. It wasn't received very well because it wasn't painting. And I wasn't just looking at textures, which I do love still, but I was looking more on my identity, and I was unearthing certain things. I've still got those on slides right now. But then he one day said, there's an exhibition at the Herbert, go and have a look. And I got so excited because when I saw the work, it was similar to what I was actually looking at.
So what show, are you talking about the 1983?
Yeah, because I had a black book, I had myself, a black child,
Yeah.
and I was looking at the words black book, black mark, black, and this child's being perpetuated with these black negative images or negative words, so I was playing on that at the time, and reading Frantz Fanon, you see. So when I saw I think it's your work, I saw here, or Claudette's, with the child, she had a gun on it, so that was probably controversial and stuff. So I was actually doing similar things, but it was John who said, wow, when he looked at the work on the screen in the room, he said, wow, there's an exhibition at the moment you might like if you're doing that kind of stuff. So I had a little bit of a light at my place, but unfortunately the whole establishment was very, very difficult because doing media work, crossing over, and doing textiles and printing and other things wasn't proper art. So it was very, very difficult. That's the exhausting part, not actually trying to get the work. And I was excited, and then I met Eddie and Keith along the way, just to help me to keep going. So I can identify with what I'm saying.
Can we hear your thoughts on this?
I don't know, I think you both said so much. I don't know what I can add really to what you said. For me personally, emotionally, I don't think that I did work that I enjoyed. It wasn't about enjoying it, it was about the necessity. It was necessary. And that's what really fed my creative practice at that time. It was about urgency and necessity rather than making stuff that I loved. I think I'm just getting to the point now where I'm allowing myself, giving myself permission to enjoy the materials and to, so I think I have a different way of approaching work now than I did then. But then it was really urgent and necessary and a responsibility to make certain types of images and to put them in certain places. Do you want to add anything to that? Or add, say something?
Oh, just, I'm just trying to kind of think back at the impulse of making work when I was a student. Obviously that was a very particular time, and we were making work for exhibitions. And so in a sense I was left alone a lot of the time by the tutors. Apart from kind of two really important interventions which were really influential, was one of the tutors introduced me to the work of Gavin Yantis, who's having a show at the Edward Tota Gallery. Amazing. Yeah, amazing. That was really influential. And the other one was Rose Garrard, who was my external examiner, who was in touch with Rashid and other people, and so introduced me to black themes. So it was that kind of conversation. And I think, but the thing about continuing to make work was because I was making work because I was part of this community, the community of the Black Art Group, etc., etc. So we were making work for that context. And then when I got to my MA, I was a really bad student. I was the worst kind of student. And I recognise that now because I was completely engaged with something outside the university. So I was hardly ever there. So yes, it's just
I was a bad BA student because I was hardly ever. I was in London. I was studying in Bradford, and I spent so much of my time in London. I can't even understand now how I managed to do that. But I felt the pull to London because once Claudette, for example, had finished her BA in Wolverhampton, she went to London. Keith went to London. Double went to London. It felt like the nucleus had shifted. It shifted, literally had physically picked itself up and gone into the capital. So I remember that.
But the important thing about London, of course, was that it was the locus of lots of other black artists.
And
so at that moment, you were then suddenly meeting all the Amanda Hollidays and all those people, and then Black Audio Film Collective.
Absolutely.
All these people were around at that time. We were all part of the same social circle with Boehner and Maud and and all that kind of stuff. So it was a really rich time.
I see there's two other comments. I need to look at Ian
Yes. So if we because we've kind of gone into our time, so
Yeah.
like 10.
Shall we leave these two questions to the second panel? Is that because Keith and Marlene are going to be with us for the second panel?
You're going to be taking, because I'm going to ask you to comment because it's about
Sorry.
your part. Yeah.
Is that okay? So
Can
that
you
we have a
save
break
those?
now because
Yeah.
we are running a little bit. So really to thank you both so much for again giving us such an amazing picture of what happened in the 80s and also how you see things disclosed unfolding today. Really thank you for that. In terms of the housekeeping notes, we will be reconvening in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
In 10 minutes
Yeah.
in this room again for the second panel. Please join me in thanking both Marlene and